Okay, we're almost a month into the school year here, and I want to talk about our first kind of progression in the wood shop in terms of how our design and fabrication course has run. And so we start off by looking at these one board builds. So our goal is to take this standard 1x6 piece of redwood fencing, and how do we turn that into a bunch of these? And then how do we turn those into a finished product, something that looks like this? So this is our pixel art project. Students are designing their own type of element that they want to make. And basically, how do they get from this piece of wood to these 1-inch squares that they can create their art from? So let me walk you through our progression. To start the year, we started off by looking at how do we design things? So how do we come up with a drawing? We started with traditional tools, traditional drafting tools. So we have a class set of T-squares, triangles, and drafting boards. So students learned how to slide the T-square up and down, use and rotate the triangle to create different design drawings. So they started off with very simple kind of two-dimensional shapes. They looked at isometric cubes. They then had to build a cube. And so from smaller cubes, they built a design drawing that could then be created by a classmate. We then moved into something that we'd actually fabricate. So they did a design drawing for a cardboard box, and then they would build that cardboard box, and that's where they're going to store a lot of their materials. After that, we have talked about how do we make a design drawing that's a little bit more detailed, that has some scale to it. So students came up with their design drawing. So they used the same tools. Again, this is paper and pencil. And then they had to talk about their material use and then their actual fabrication process. And at this point, we start to move into actual tool use. There's a lot of safety training that goes into it, but really talking about how do we make this happen? And so students would be given their board. We talked about it as an order of operations. So we talked about the thickness of the board. We talked about our cross cut, our rip cut on the table saw. And what that gives us is a bunch of lumber that is 1 inch wide and then varying lengths. So students come away with this. And so then how do we cross cut this in a way that we can get all of our pixels or 1-inch squares out of it? So what we developed is this guy. We could run everything through the table saw with a crosscut sled, but that would take a long time for 30 students to cut out a couple hundred pixels each. So what this is it's analogous to your standard miter box. And so we have only a couple of these in the classroom. These are your standard miter boxes, right, where you can slide a handsaw in there and then cut things. One of the issues with this is we don't have enough. The other issue is you'll actually see that there's a lot of play in here. So as a student would put the saw in here, right, you get some wiggle room, especially as you're coming through there, that is potentially problematic. The last piece is you can't really make something out of this that you have as a jig. And so the way this is set up is it can attach to a piece of plywood that can then be clamped to a table. And so you're able to cut in a zero clearance kerf into this piece of 3D printed plastic so that when you do that, you have very little wiggle room in your actual material. And so what students did is they created their own cutting jig based on that principle. And so we have the ability the first time through to align our blade. So this helps align so that we can get that vertical as we cut through and design that and have that zero clearance kerf. Students then put 2 blocks of wood with the correct dimension this way and dimension this way using the material so that in the end they can basically cut out a pixel and then simply slide down that piece of wood and create their next pixel. So that was our process. It took us about 2 weeks of fabrication, about 2 weeks before to kind of just learn design elements and do the safety training. But in the end, students came up with incredible projects that were personalized, and they got to go through that whole step of how we go from design to fabrication.